If you could take your seats, please, we're going to begin now. If you could take your seats. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ken Wallach, president of NDI. I want to welcome you to our celebration of the 2011 Averill Harriman Democracy Award and the Madeleine K. Albright Grant. Tonight we honor the Harriman Award to three individuals who passed away in the last year: Geraldine Ferraro, Richard Holbrook, and Charles Manat. Each of them was essential to our existence and to our work. Each of them added their commitment at a time when democracy building was no sure thing. Since 1984, NDI has worked in more than 100 countries with, at last count, 1,400 civic groups, 720 political parties, 10,000 parliamentarians, and 1,300 women's rights organizations. NDI has brought people together with diverse experiences and expertise. The people-to-people nature of our work has been expanded in recent years to include online tools to impart knowledge, share ideas, and connect people and groups. This diversity of democratic experience is more than a symbol. It has a practical value. We know that there is no one model for democracy, but rather many models and many experiences. We know, too, that as the community of democracies has grown, democratic practice has become inseparable from democratic cooperation and solidarity. But the recipients of tonight's Harriman Award are a reminder that this cooperation and solidarity not only reaches across borders, regions, and continents, they also cross generations. With these three leaders in mind, it is significant that tonight we bestow the Madeleine Albright Grant on the Egyptian women's organization, ACT. With the Arab Spring, we see ACT as a vindication of all the work that has gone before, even more because it focuses on the empowerment of women and their inclusion in a new Egypt. For Jerry, Chuck, and Richard, ACT is a legacy of their hope. There are a number of individuals and groups whom I want to acknowledge tonight. I want to particularly recognize our board of directors, whose leadership, commitment, and generosity are central to the Institute's efforts. I would like to recognize those who are here tonight and to ask them to stand as their names are called: Bernie Aronson, Hattie Babbitt, Elizabeth Bagley, Joan Calamakitis, Robin Carnahan, Howard Dean, Jean Eidenberg, Pat Griffin, Rochelle Horowitz, Peter Kovler, Rob Libertor, Ken Melly, Molly Razor, Nancy Rubin, Elaine Shokas, Mike Steed, Maurice Templesman, Linda Thomas, Rich Verma, and Randy Weingarten. Madeleine Albright was the Institute's founding vice chair some 27 years ago. She left briefly for a couple of obscure government posts and returned as chairman in 2001. Her leadership has expanded the reach and enhanced the standing of NDI in so many ways. With us tonight are board members and staff of the National Endowment for Democracy and our 3 affiliated institutes, IRI, the Solidarity Center, and CITE. We are honored by the presence of members and staff of the Senate and House. The Congress has always been and remains an inspiration for democratic activists around the world. And I want to particularly thank Senators Mikulski, Landrieu, and Gillibrand, and Representatives Engel and Maloney for joining us. And I would like to also recognize the Governor of Maryland, Governor O'Malley. NDI has benefited from the support of 5 administrations, and we are heartened by the Obama administration's dedicated commitment to a more democratic world. And we are pleased that officials from the White House, State Department, USAID, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation are with us. They represent our support network and our allies in the field. And we are deeply honored that the Secretary of State will be delivering tonight's keynote address. At its heart, NDI is a public-private partnership, so I especially want to single out those who made this evening possible: the corporations, trade unions, foundations, and individual donors. Each of them is listed in the program and on the screens and gratefully acknowledged. I want to welcome the diplomatic corps and political leaders from abroad, and I would like to express our gratitude to those in this room and hundreds of others around the globe who volunteer their time to assist NDI's efforts. Above all, I want to recognize Vice President Sherry Bryan and NDI's talented staff, 88 nationalities in all. Working in environments that are challenging, remote, and sometimes dangerous, they are the heart of NDI, and in their dedication, they are our face to the world. NDI is not alone in carrying out its democratic development mission. We are part of a growing global community that includes governments, non-governmental organizations, and intergovernmental bodies, both here and abroad. Each of us benefit from our mutual support. This democratic support community is united in its belief of a common humanity, that in this growing interdependent world, we are truly responsible for one another. We are privileged to have Walter Isaacson here tonight to make the presentation of this year's Madeleine Albright Grant and to summarize the panel discussion on the Arab Spring that preceded this dinner. In truth, you cannot introduce Walter Isaacson without resorting to superlatives. To put it another way, how does any one human being accomplish all these things? Walter is president and CEO of the Aspen Institute, the former chairman and CEO of CNN, and the former managing editor of Time magazine. President Obama appointed him to chair the Broadcasting Board of Governors. These days, we know him especially as the author of what will surely become one of the best-selling biographies of all time, Steve Jobs. He also wrote 3 other remarkable biographical works on Albert Einstein, Benjamin Franklin, and Henry Kissinger. He co-authored The Wise Men, which has become the seminal study of the U.S. foreign policy establishment in the mid-20th century. One of those chronicled was Averell Harriman, the man NDI honors with its annual Democracy Award. In recent weeks, when he is not speaking and writing about Steve Jobs, Walter chairs Teach for America and is the vice chair of Partnerships for a New Beginning, which supports private sector investments and partnerships in the Muslim world. Our own Madeleine Albright chairs the organization, which was initiated by Secretary Clinton. Ladies and gentlemen, Walter Isaacson.
Thank you very much. We started this evening with a panel on Arab democracy, and where the reform movement is headed. And I would love it if I could to introduce the people who are on that panel, and you could give them a round of applause. Atiya Lagwali from Libya, Sheikh Mohammed Abu Lahoum from Yemen, Dr. Amal Habib Al-Youssef from Bahrain. Would you all stand up? I can't really see. There's Dr. Mohammed Al-Abdallah of Syria, Rafat Al-Akhali from Yemen, Dr. Munira Fakhara from Bahrain, and somebody you'll see in a moment, without spoiling the surprise for you, Dr. Azza Kamal of Egypt. I was asked by Ken to moderate this panel, which was an incredibly easy job because everybody was talking, they were filled with ideas, and it moved very quickly. I was also asked by Ken to summarize the panel, and that's a very difficult job because so much was said and it was so interesting. But let me just point out a couple of things that they said. A lot of us who have watched the Arab Spring, we live by this sort of new maxim that each of these are separate. Each of these revolutions are separate. That they're, we shouldn't look upon them as one big movement. I think in a lot of ways the panelists disabused us of that idea. Whether it was Rafat talking about the youth movement and how on the Facebook pages the people in Yemen and Libya and Syria and Egypt all work together, or Dr. Kamal talking about women's movements, how they all work together, and all the panelists talking about how the reform movement in the Arab Spring has helped transcend the sectarian strife between Sunnis and Shias and other groups in that region. It became very clear that, like in 1848 or 1968, a lot of these reform movements and democracy movements are connected by a common set of values. Secretary Albright talked about those values, which are basic human values that we all yearn for wherever we live or whatever sect we're from. The value of being respected and having a role in the governance of your society. I did particularly appreciate Mr. Lagali of Libya saying that in Libya and in Texas are the two places you can wave an American flag now and be cheered. I do think, Ken, NDI does not have a chapter in Texas, but you're doing a great job in Libya. So it's my pleasure now to present the Madeleine K. Albright Grant, which is bestowed by the by NDI each year to honor an international organization that creates greater roles for women in political and civic life. Secretary Albright was NDI's founding vice chair, and since 2001, its chairman. Her own life story speaks directly to the potential that women throughout the world have. But I'd also like to say her own life story speaks of the potential that every human being has in furthering the cause of democracy. Because she was an exile from the twin evils, the twin opponents to the causes of democracy of the 20th century, Nazism and communism. She found her home in the U.S. and contributed immeasurably to the development of our own democracy while never forgetting the struggles of people who fight for freedom everywhere. This year's Madeleine Albright Grant is awarded to Egypt's Appropriate Communication Techniques for Development Center, known as ACT. And this year of the Arab Spring, NDI is proud that the recipients helped strengthen the political and social engagement of Arab women. Though not always credited, except for in our panel earlier this evening, women have played a critical role in inspiring the events in Tunisia, Yemen, Egypt, Bahrain, and elsewhere. We know that the advancement of women is central to development, central here in our country. My wife is involved with the Washington Area Women's Foundation, but it's helped me learn that women are essential to development in every part of the world and in every community. the status of women is particularly of concern in the Arab world, where in some nations more than half the women are illiterate and they don't have the political power they do elsewhere. They're impeded by laws and by cultural attitudes. There is a real concern that women will be sidelined in the aftermath of the revolutions when the protests give way to governing. On the other hand, there's a real opportunity that the Arab Reform Spring will mean the great liberation of women coming to their proper seats of power and helping to lead the Arab world and the rest of the world to a better place. ACT is a counterbalance to the concerns of what could happen. It was founded in 1992 as an Egyptian NGO working in development and women's rights. It provides training and consultation for civic institutions that advance not just women's rights, but all human rights. The center brings together a distinguished team of experts, administrators, and development specialists. Its operational units include elements devoted to training, human resources, gender issues, civic education, and media watch. In the aftermath of 2011, ACT is on the cutting edge of political change in Egypt. Its vision statement asserts, "We are a group of women and men activists in the field of advocating women's rights, eager to build a just and democratic community where all forms of discrimination are eliminated, whether based on sex, race, color, creed, ideology, political views, or social class." That's a manifesto and a vision statement we all could learn from wherever we are. ACT leads political coalitions that are working to change the status of women in Egypt's legal system and society. It is involved in efforts to pass laws against domestic violence and to punish sexual harassment. Ultimately, ACT is helping to construct the next Egypt, a new Egypt. With more than 5,000 years of history, this ancient land is both a traditional, yet also a very modern society. So NDI is privileged to bestow the 2011 Madeleine K. Albright Grant on ACT. We hope this award will help ACT assume a greater role in determining the future of Egypt. And to accept the grant tonight was one of the stars of our panel earlier this evening, Dr. Azil Kamel, the director of ACT and the founder of the Women's Research Center. Dr. Kamel holds a PhD in civic education, published many studies in the areas of sexual harassment, the impact of violence on women, the image of men and women in the media, and many other fields. She has worked with NGOs and private organizations to build up the participation of women. Dr. Kamel is the coordinator of Egypt's Women's Mock Parliament. She was a founding member of the Feminist Coalition, which was established after the revolution earlier this year. If I can invite you up, Dr. Kamel, so that we, I hope Secretary Albright and the rest of us, can present you with the 5th Annual Madeleine K. Albright Award. Thank you so much. I'm sorry about mangling your names. I sure appreciate what you've done.
Thank you. On behalf of ACT, I wish to thank NDI for awarding us the 2011 Madeleine K. Albright Grant. We are especially honored that Secretary Albright is with us tonight. Dr. Albright, you are an example of women's empowerment and participation. Your career is an inspiration to ACT and the women of Egypt. The Arab Spring was more than what was reported in the media. Tahrir Square in Cairo certainly was the focal point, but people came into the streets across Egypt. Women had the courage to join the front lines alongside men, not only in the capital, but throughout the country. We helped make the revolution. Now, we want to shape the society that will emerge, like women everywhere who are invested in our families and our children. Working together, we can achieve what seemed impossible a few short months ago: democratic rights for all and the proper place of women in Egypt's public life. Our purpose at ACT is to unite women across Egypt and throughout the Arab world, reaching out to women everywhere and helping them find common ground. The near absence of women in the new government and likelihood that few women will be elected to parliament next month is of a great concern to us. It is this parliament that will write the new constitution, and the ACT is reaching out to women throughout Egypt to build a coalition that cannot be ignored and will not be silenced. This award will help me and my wonderful team at ACT to be there every step of the way, participating in the processes and providing the pressure that will be necessary to encourage and safeguard the realization of our collective dreams in Egypt. The quest for freedom, dignity, and justice that inspired the revolution is not just the privilege of men. Egyptian women wanted to lead empowered lives, free of violence, with equal access to the decision-making process. That has been our message, and the Madeleine K. Albright Grant will enable us to carry it forward to the men and women of Egypt and the Arab world. Thank you, NDI, for your support and your vote for confidence in the future of my country. Thank you.
This is the eating portion of the dinner. We'll be back in 25 minutes. Can I have your attention? I have not reappeared here to simply deliver an introduction of a famous person. This is too personal for NDI and to me. Madeleine Albright has gone by many titles: doctor, professor, ambassador, secretary. But to NDI, she is our chairman, and her life and work has personified our mission. She has been anything but a figurehead. She has dedicated an enormous amount of her time and prestige to our efforts. She is our working chairman, our friend, our leader. It is my privilege to introduce Secretary Madeleine Corbell Albright.
Ken, thank you very, very much for your kind introductions, and congratulations on your continued and superb leadership here at NDI. I think there is no way to express what Ken and Sherry and Les and the other members of the NDI team do on a daily basis. I couldn't be prouder of them, but it is Ken who has really kept NDI at the forefront of everything that is going on in democracy. So I am truly, truly grateful and thrilled to be his partner in all the work that the National Democratic Institute does. Excellencies from the Diplomatic Corps and Capitol Hill and distinguished guests and friends from overseas and supporters of NDI, good evening to everybody. I am delighted that we're all here together. Not long ago, when I was wondering what to say tonight, I noticed one of those newspaper articles we often see entitled 5 Myths about one topic or another. And I think in this case it was actually about the G20. Such articles usually attempt to show why 5 things that we never thought were true are in fact false, thus leaving us no wiser, but still somehow feeling really, really smart. If an article of this type were to be written about NDI, I suspect that the first myth would be that our organization's role is trying to impose democracy across the globe. And that is, of course, not the case. We invest the majority of our time and resources in countries that have already chosen the democratic path. Our mission is to help fragile governments overcome such obstacles as poverty, disease, disunity, and crime, to strengthen the muscle and sinew of their democratic institutions, and to deliver on the promise of political freedom. It's true that we also take an interest in Cuba, Burma, Belarus, and other lands where courageous Democrats are still struggling in the face of repression to establish their rights. But by definition, democracy reflects the popular will. It cannot be forced on any country. So make no mistake, in any society, under any circumstances, dictatorship is an imposition. Democracy is a choice. This distinction is vital because increasingly autocrats try to use NDI and its partner organizations as scapegoats. They would like the world to believe that such novel ideas as fair elections and freedom of speech would never occur to their citizens if not for outside meddling. There's an old Czechoslovak expression for this kind of thinking, balderdash. My advice for any such government is to invest in a mirror and clean up its act, because the democratic tide that some thought had been receding in recent years has in fact returned. From the city squares of Tunis and Cairo to the crowded neighborhoods of Damascus and Sana'a to the sun-scorched streets of Manama and Tripoli, the desire for freedom has emerged not because of any foreign hand, but because the yearning to express one's views without fears comes as naturally to people who dwell there and near the Mediterranean or Red Seas as to those living along the Potomac, as our panel today showed. Arab Spring has evolved into a movement for all seasons, a resurgence of historic dimensions that is not yet fully defined in scope, shape, or outcome. Much depends on choices that will be made in the months immediately ahead, choices that can only be made by the people who live in the region. But as it has done so many times in the past, NDI offers help to those who desire help, to share our expertise, our training, and the knowledge gained over more than a quarter of a century of supporting democratic practices and civic engagement across the globe. In that time, NDI, like democracy, has had good days and not so good. Because of developments in the Arab world, this year has been among the most encouraging and fascinating. But the past months have also been a time of loss. Since our last annual dinner, we have said goodbye to 3 very, very dear friends who were among our nation's most prominent and beloved champions of democracy. It's appropriate that we celebrate their contributions tonight by designating them as recipients of the highest honor NDI can bestow, the W. Averill Harriman Award. I don't know about you, but there are some moments that I will recall for as long as I live. And right at the top of that list is hearing these words: I am Geraldine Ferraro, and I'm running for Vice President of the United States. To many of us, the very name Jerry Ferraro is a synonym for democracy. As a politician and as a leader for human rights, she cared more, fought harder, and talked faster than just about anybody else. When she was on a mission, it was best to stay out of her way, for she was the embodiment of a trailblazer. And I tonight am privileged to wear a pin that was hers, that her family gave me, a cameo of a woman, a trailblazer. With Jerry during much of the 1984 campaign, which as some of you may recall was a bit of an uphill fight, I was able to travel with her. The economy was booming and Ronald Reagan was a formidable opponent. Meanwhile, there were many people in the media who had trouble coping with a woman candidate. Either they wrote about Jerry's hair or choice of jackets, or they tried to trip her up by asking completely ridiculous questions about weapons technology, which they never would have asked George Bush. But every time they attempted to patronize her, she turned the tables and embarrassed them, because she was as tough as they come, and she certainly knew her stuff. As a campaigner, she was amazing. Parents would lift up their daughters and sons just to catch a glimpse, and she made her audiences laugh and cheer and think deeply about the future direction of our country. The crowds were so enthusiastic that right up until the last rousing speech, I was sure we were going to pull a Truman and shock everybody. Unfortunately, there are some aspects of democracy that we have to accept, no matter how unjust they might seem. And one is that the people who disagree with us are still entitled to vote. But the results of that election did nothing to dampen Geraldine Ferraro's desire to serve. She really, under President Clinton, she was our country's ambassador to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, a natural position for her. In the face of exploitation, Jerry was incapable of silence. She was the voice for those who could otherwise not be heard. She also served on the board of the National Democratic Institute, where she created a landmark initiative to train and empower women leaders. For Jerry, the context, whether local or global, did not matter. To her, suffering and injustice were always unacceptable, and so was complacency. Just last fall, she contacted me about a project she had conceived to fight discrimination against women in religions across the globe. Even in her final days, she was thinking and striving to create a better future. That message is her legacy, and it explains why we are so pleased to honor her this evening. So, John, would you please come forward to accept on behalf of your wife the Averil Harriman Democracy Award? When Jerry Ferraro was nominated for vice president, the incumbent national chairman of the Democratic National Committee was Charles Manat, or to everyone who knew him, Chuck. In 1984, he became the founding chair of a brand new pro-democracy organization called the National Democratic Institute. Under his guidance, the blueprints were drawn up that would transform a tiny group of doers working in a handful of countries into an action team with programs and friends in virtually every corner of the globe. No one was more skilled than Chuck at preaching the good news about democracy, but he was even more a practitioner of it. To him, the rough and tumble of electoral politics was more exciting than any sport, but he also belonged to a tradition that defined that activity differently than many do today. Chuck and Frank Fahrenkopf, his counterpart at the Republican National Committee, considered democratic competition to be an honorable profession and an essential part of public service, not an invitation to sling mud. Rumor has it that Chuck and Frank even liked each other, But to find out for sure, you can ask Mr. Fahrenkopf directly, for we are delighted to have him with us this evening. The collaboration between these two fine men had much to do with the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy, NDI, IRI, and its other affiliated institutions. This was at a time when Ronald Reagan was in the White House and the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives. There's a word for what they accomplished: bipartisanship. And there's a term as well for Chuck Manat: the best. Whether as party chair or head of NDI or director of the International Foundation for Electoral System, or as our nation's ambassador to Santo Domingo, Chuck Manat could be counted on to carry out his leadership and his role with brilliance, honor, and an abiding commitment to freedom. He has been called one of the architects of the global democracy movement, which puts him in pretty good company, for the same could be said of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Kathleen Manat, in recognition of your husband's lifetime of service, please accept with our gratitude the 2011 W. Averill Harriman Award.
This year has been a tumultuous year throughout the world, and in particular in the Middle East and North Africa. It's also been a year of great loss for our family. But let us all hope that the work of NDI, both here in Washington and all over the globe, will continue to bear the fruits and the promise of democracy, as Chuck and Secretary Albright envisioned nearly 30 years ago. So I thank you to all of NDI, and particularly from all of my family. It's a great honor to accept this award for Chuck.
I mentioned earlier those articles about 5 myths that we sometimes see in newspapers. There would be no point in writing such a piece about Richard Holbrooke, because all the myths are true. I have often heard him described as a force of nature, but that can be misleading because in addition to the occasional storm, nature is responsible for the stillness before dawn and the first gentle breezes of spring. Richard Holbrooke was never still, and his gentleness was of a very distinctive sort. There are many stories about him, and a few which he could be forced under duress to tell himself. But tonight, given the limitations of time, I will say simply that he was a true Democrat, as true as ever lived. During the Balkan Wars, we used to say that we were joined at the hip, and he really made it a point to believe in what we were doing. He probably talked to as many dictators and demagogues as any public figure of his generation, and he could reason and do business with them shrewdly, but he never accepted an excuse for repression and never lost sight of our country's purpose. He had all the skills of a consummate pragmatist, but he never confused the merely convenient with what was right. Like the magnificent diplomat he was, he put every ounce of his talents in service to his ideals, which were laser-sharp and based on a deeply felt commitment to the dignity of every human being. He may be remembered best for the Dayton Peace Accords, but that's just the barest surface of what he achieved. The fact is that in many discussions of America's role, he came down on the side of leading instead of standing aside, of pursuing justice even in the presence of grave risk, and of using our influence to help those trapped by conflict, poverty, and disease. These traits were in evidence at every stage of his career, from his early days in the Foreign Service and Peace Corps to his time in the Carter administration to his contributions in the Clinton years as Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Ambassador to the UN, and finally as President Obama's special advisor on Pakistan and Afghanistan. He also served as a member of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. In every position and at all times, he could be trusted with the hardest jobs and relied on to fight on the side of the angels. According to myth, Richard Holbrooke was one of a kind, and if that were true, he would be irreplaceable, and irreplaceable is exactly what he is. All of us here at NDI joy in paying tribute to Richard Holbrooke and in welcoming the award-winning author and journalist Cathy Marton, who will offer a few words of her own about her husband's remarkable career.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is such a meaningful award. I think I'm going to kick this away for a minute. I feel like I'm... This award is meaningful to Richard and to me on so many levels. He loved NDI and was so proud of his association with NDI and absolutely shared its values and lived those values. And he was also Averell Harriman's protege. The governor, as Richard always called him, plucked the 25-year-old FSO from obscurity and took him to Paris as the youngest member of the Vietnam peace talks. Richard's title was expert, only he didn't know what he was supposed to be an expert in. From Vietnam to Afghanistan, Richard held on to his conviction that America had a very special role to play in the world, and that military power has to be used only as a very last resort. That was the lesson that he drew from his 5 years in Vietnam and in authoring one volume of the Pentagon Papers. It's impossible for me to condense Richard's remarkable career into a couple of minutes, but what I took away from that career is that Richard was a team builder, and what a team he built during his final mission. A globe-spanning team of Afghanistan and Pakistani specialists. Maureen White, my dear friend, is here, a member of that team. When President Obama appointed Richard to be special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, he was the only one in the world. When Richard died, there were 42 counterparts from all over the world representing Afghanistan and Pakistan, including from many Muslim nations. That was his way, always to reach out, cast a wide net, build coalitions. In her Berlin eulogy to Richard, Secretary of State Clinton said that we don't have Richard to advise us in Libya, but we have his principles. And if I may quote another Clinton on Richard, President Bill Clinton, who said of my husband, he was a hurricane of energy, eloquence, and force. I loved the guy, President Clinton said, because he could do. Doing in diplomacy saves lives. In the end, what matters is that there are a lot of people walking around on the face of the earth today, or their children, or their grandchildren, because of the way Richard Holbrooke lived his life. Those are President Clinton's words. Thank you. I can't improve on those words, but I'll leave you with 4 words that were not in Richard's vocabulary. Nothing can be done. I look out at you and I know that each of you has a Holbrooke story and a Holbrooke memory, and I hope you keep telling them. And thank you for this wonderful honor.
It is now my honor to introduce our keynote speaker. Tonight, I think, is a little like introducing the sky to greet the sun. After all, it's not like we're exactly unaware of Hillary Clinton's existence. She is a best-selling author, a Grammy Award winner, a former First Lady, a former senator from the great state of New York, and currently serving as America's 67th Secretary of State. If that were not enough, she's also a prior recipient of the Averell Harriman Award. We all know her well, and we're all aware that she has been doing an absolutely outstanding job in a world that refuses even for a minute to stand still. In less than 3 years, she has helped President Obama restore our nation's reputation and leadership, lent fresh energy to partnerships across the globe, and created a new foundation for progress on issues that range from terrorism and arms control to human development and the empowerment of women. In the process, she has assembled a stellar State Department team, made creative use of every available foreign policy tool, earned the abiding respect of our armed forces, and generated enthusiasm wherever she has traveled. Those of us who have seen her abroad know that she's an incomparable representative for our country. She doesn't just make appearances, she makes connections by explaining the goals that guide our actions and the interests that we share with law-abiding people on every continent. What you may not know is that our Secretary of State has also been a stalwart defender of NDI in a number of countries where our work has been challenged and our status placed in jeopardy. Given her position, it would have been easy for her to point to the press of other business and priorities, but instead she has made clear that defending the truth about what we do is a priority, and that on her watch, supporting democratic institutions and values is at the very heart of American foreign policy. The Arab democracy movement is only one area among many where our Secretary of State has acted in a timely and effective way to keep our alliances together, maintain our nation's commitments, defend our security, and uphold our ideals. It gives me great pleasure to introduce one friend to many others. Please welcome Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. If I might say, everybody in this room supports you and offers our sympathy for the death of your really remarkable mother. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here this evening, and I thank my friend and my predecessor, Madeleine Albright, for not only that kind introduction, but for her extraordinary leadership, and in particular of NDI. Thanks also to Sherry Bryan and Ken Wallach for inviting me here today, and I want to begin by wishing an Eid Mubarak to Muslims here tonight and around the world. I think it's important to recognize that back when the streets of Arab cities were quiet, the National Democratic Institute was already on the ground, building relationships, supporting the voices that would turn a long Arab winter into a new Arab spring. Now, we may not know where and when brave people will claim their rights next, but it's a safe bet that NDI is there now, because freedom knows no better champion. More than a quarter century old, NDI and its siblings in the National Endowment for Democracy family have become vital elements of America's engagement with the world. And tonight I want particularly to congratulate the winners of NDI's 2011 Madeleine Albright Award, the Women of Appropriate Communication Techniques for Development. Women risked everything to demand their rights for the Egyptian people, and they deserve those rights extended to them. And so we're grateful for their work, and we hope to see the rights that they fought for and advocated for enshrined in Egypt's new constitution, and we're proud to support efforts like these through our Middle East Partnership Initiative. Now, tonight it's also a singular, special honor for me to join with you in remembering three friends of NDI, three people I was lucky enough to call my friends as well. Geraldine Ferraro, a trailblazing pioneer who lived to the fullest her conviction that women belong at the heart of democracy. Chuck Manat, a passionate chairman of the Democratic National Committee, who understood that some things are too important to belong to any one party, and with his counterpart at the RNC, Frank Fahrenkopf, put together a bipartisan coalition to found the National Endowment for Democracy. And of course, the indomitable, unforgettable Richard Holbrooke. Now, Richard has many reasons why those of us here tonight applaud and remember him. He died just 4 days before the desperate act of a Tunisian fruit vendor set the Arab uprisings in motion. And I often wonder what Richard would have made of all that has happened since. I'm sure he would have had a lot to say and even more that he wanted to do to promote the principles that we all cherish. And so these three individuals are very worthy of the awards that you have granted them this evening. And what a year 2011 has been for freedom in the Middle East and North Africa. We have seen what may well have been the first Arab revolution for democracy, then the second, then the third. And in Yemen, people are demanding a transition to democracy that they deserve to see delivered. And Syrians are refusing to relent until they too can decide their own future. Throughout the Arab world this year, people have given each other courage. Old fears have melted away, and men and women have begun making their demands in broad daylight. They have given many of our diplomats courage too. And I want to single out someone who is here with us tonight. When our ambassador to Syria was mobbed, assaulted, and threatened just for meeting with peaceful protesters, he put his personal safety on the line to let the Syrian people know that America stands with them. And he said he was inspired by their bravery. And as he drove into Hama, a city under assault by Assad's regime, the people of that city covered his car with flowers. Please join me in giving our own warm welcome to Ambassador Robert Ford, his wife, and fellow Foreign Service Officer Allison Barkley. Thanks to you, Robert, and to you, Allison, for your dedicated service to our country. Now, in Tunis, Cairo, and a newly free Tripoli, I have met people lifted by a sense that their futures actually do belong to them. And in my travels across the region, I have heard joy, purpose, and newfound pride. But I've also heard questions. I've heard skepticism about American motives and commitments, people wondering if, after decades of our working with the governments of the region, America doesn't, in our heart of hearts, actually long for the old days. I've heard from activists who think we aren't pushing hard enough for democratic change, and I've heard from government officials who think we're pushing too hard. I've heard from people asking why our policies vary from country to country, and what would happen if elections bring to power parties we don't agree with or people who just don't like us very much. I've heard people asking America to solve all their problems, and others wondering whether we have any role to play at all. And beneath our excitement for the millions who are claiming the rights and freedoms we cherish, many Americans are asking the same questions. Tonight, I want to ask and answer a few of these tough questions. It's a fitting tribute to people like Jerry Ferraro and Richard Holbrooke and Chuck Manat. They liked to pose difficult questions and then push us to answer them. And in Richard's case, that meant even following me into a ladies' room in Pakistan one time. As we live this history day by day, we approach these questions with a large dose of humility, because many of the choices ahead are honestly not ours to make. Still, it's worth stepping back and doing our best to speak directly to what is on people's minds. So let me start with one question I hear often. Do we really believe that democratic change in the Middle East and North Africa is in America's interests? That is a totally fair question. After all, transitions are filled with uncertainty. They can be chaotic, unstable, even violent. And even if they succeed, they are rarely linear, quick, or easy. As we saw in the Balkans and again in Iraq, rivalries between members of different religions, sects, and tribes can resurface and explode. Toppling tyrants does not guarantee that democracy will follow or that it will last. Just ask the Iranians, who overthrew a dictator 32 years ago, only to have their revolution hijacked by the extremists who have oppressed them ever since. And even where democracy does take hold, it is a safe bet that some of those elected will not embrace us or agree with our policies. And yet, as President Obama said at the State Department in May, it will be the policy of the United States to promote reform across the region and to support transitions to democracy. We believe that real democratic change in the Middle East and North Africa is in the national interest of the United States. And here's why. We begin by rejecting the false choice between progress and stability. For years, dictators told their people they had to accept the autocrats they knew to avoid the extremists they feared. And too often, we accepted that narrative ourselves. Now, America did push for reform, but often not hard enough or publicly enough. And today we recognize that the real choice is between reform and unrest. Last January, I told Arab leaders that the region's foundations were sinking into the sand. Even if we didn't know exactly how or when the breaking point would come, it was clear that the status quo was unsustainable because of changes in demography and technology, high unemployment, endemic corruption, and a lack of human rights and fundamental freedoms. After a year of revolutions broadcast on Al Jazeera into homes from Rabat to Riyadh, going back to the way things were in December 2010 isn't just undesirable, it's impossible. The truth is that the greatest single source of instability in today's Middle East is not the demand for change, it is the refusal to change. That is certainly true in Syria, where a crackdown on small, peaceful protests drove thousands into the streets and thousands more over the borders. It is true in Yemen, where President Saleh has reneged repeatedly on his promises to transition to democracy and suppressed his people's rights and freedoms. And it is true in Egypt. If, over time, the most powerful political force in Egypt remains a room full of unelected officials, they will have planted the seeds for future unrest, and Egyptians will have missed a historic opportunity. And so will we, because democracies make for stronger and stabler partners. They trade more, innovate more, and fight less. They help divided societies to air and hopefully resolve their differences. They hold inept leaders accountable at the polls. They channel people's energies away from extremism and toward political and civic engagement. Now, democracies do not always agree with us, and in the Middle East and North Africa, they may disagree strongly with some of our policies. But at the end of the day, it is no coincidence that our closest allies, from Britain to South Korea, are democracies. Now, we do work with many different governments to pursue our interests and to keep Americans safe, and certainly not all of them are democracies. But as the fall of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt made clear, the enduring cooperation we seek will be difficult to sustain without democratic legitimacy and public consent. We cannot have one set of policies to advance security in the here and now, and another to promote democracy in a long run that never quite arrives. So for all these reasons, as I said back in March, opening political systems, societies, and economies is not simply a matter of idealism. It is a strategic necessity. But we are not simply acting in our self-interest. Americans believe that the desire for dignity and self-determination is universal, and we do try to act on that belief around the world. Americans have fought and died for these ideals. And when freedom gains ground anywhere, Americans are inspired. So the risks posed by transitions will not keep us from pursuing positive change, but they do raise the stakes for getting it right. Free, fair, and meaningful elections are essential, but they are not enough if they bring new autocrats to power or disenfranchise minorities. And any democracy that does not include half its population, its women, is a contradiction in terms. Durable democracies depend on strong civil societies, respect for the rule of law, independent institutions, free expression, and a free press. Legitimate political parties cannot have a militia wing and a political wing. Parties have to accept the results of free and fair elections. And this is not just in the Middle East. In Liberia, the leading opposition party is making unsubstantiated charges of fraud and refusing to accept first-round voting in which it came in second. And this is already having harmful consequences on the ground. We urge all parties in Liberia to accept the will of the people in the next round of voting tomorrow. That is what democracy anywhere requires. And that brings me to my second question. Why does America promote democracy one way in some countries and another way in others? Well, the answer starts with a very practical point. Situations vary dramatically from country to country. It would be foolish to take a one-size-fits-all approach and barrel forward regardless of circumstances on the ground. Sometimes, as in Libya, we can bring dozens of countries together to protect civilians and help people liberate their country without a single American life lost. In other cases, to achieve that same goal, we would have to act alone at a much greater cost, with far greater risks, and perhaps even with troops on the ground. But that's just part of the answer. Our choices also reflect other interests in the region with a real impact on Americans' lives, including our fight against al-Qaeda, defense of our allies, and a secure supply of energy. Over time, a more democratic Middle East and North Africa can provide a more sustainable basis for addressing all three of those challenges. But there will be times when not all of our interests align. We work to align them, but that is just reality. As a country with many complex interests, we'll always have to walk and chew gum at the same time. That is our challenge in a country like Bahrain, which has been America's close friend and partner for decades. And yet, President Obama and I have been frank, in public and in private, that mass arrests and brute force are at odds with the universal rights of Bahrain's citizens and will not make legitimate calls for reform go away. Meaningful reform and equal treatment for all Bahrainis are in Bahrain's interest, in the region's interest, and in ours, while endless unrest benefits Iran and extremists. The government has recognized the need for dialogue, reconciliation, and concrete reforms, and they have committed to provide access to human rights groups, to allow peaceful protest, and to ensure that those who cross lines in responding to civil unrest are held accountable. King Hamad called for an independent commission of inquiry, which will issue its report soon. And we do intend to hold the Bahraini government to these commitments and to encourage the opposition to respond constructively to secure lasting reform. We also have candid conversations with others in the neighborhood, like Saudi Arabia, a country that is key to stability and peace, about our view that democratic advancement is not just possible, but a necessary part of preparing for the future. Fundamentally, there is a right side of history, and we want to be on it. And without exception, we want our partners in the region to reform so that they are on it as well. Now, we don't expect countries to do this overnight, but without reforms, we are convinced their challenges will only grow. So it is in their interests to begin now. These questions about our interests and consistency merge in a third difficult question. How will America respond if and when democracy brings to power people and parties we disagree with? We hear these questions most often when it comes to Islamist religious parties. Now, of course, I hasten to add that not all Islamists are alike. Turkey and Iran are both governed by parties with religious roots, but their models and behavior are radically different. There are plenty of political parties with religious affiliation, Hindu, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, that respect the rules of democratic politics. The suggestion that faithful Muslims cannot thrive in a democracy is insulting, dangerous, and wrong. They do it in this country every day. Now, reasonable people can disagree on a lot, but there are things that all parties, religious and secular, must get right. Not just for us to trust them, but most importantly for the people of the region and of the countries themselves to trust them to protect their hard-won rights. Parties committed to democracy must reject violence. They must abide by the rule of law and respect the freedoms of speech, religion, association, and assembly. They must respect the rights of women and minorities. They must let go of power if defeated at the polls. And in a region with deep divisions within and between religions, they cannot be the spark that starts a conflagration. In other words, what parties call themselves is less important to us than what they actually do. We applaud NDI for its work to arrive at a model code of conduct for political parties across the political spectrum and around the globe. We need to reinforce these norms and to hold people accountable for following them. In Tunisia, an Islamist party has just won a plurality of the votes in an open, competitive election. Its leaders have promised to embrace freedom of religion and full rights for women. To write a constitution and govern, they will have to persuade secular parties to work with them. And as they do, America will work with them too, because we share the desire to see a Tunisian democracy emerge that delivers for its citizens, and because America respects the right of the Tunisian people to choose their own leaders. And so we move forward with clear convictions. Parties and candidates must respect the rules of democracy, to take part in elections and hold elective office. And no one has the right to use the trappings of democracy to deny the rights and security of others. People throughout the region worry about this prospect, and so do we. Nobody wants another Iran. Nobody wants to see political parties with military wings and militant foreign policies gain influence. When members of any group seek to oppress their fellow citizens or undermine core democratic principles, we will stand on the side of the people who push back to defend their democracy. And that brings me to my next question. What is America's role in the Arab Spring? These revolutions are not ours. They are not by us, for us, or against us, but we do have a role. We have the resources, capabilities, and expertise to support those who seek peaceful, meaningful democratic reform. And with so much that can go wrong and so much that can go right, support for emerging Arab democracies is an investment we cannot afford not to make. Now, of course, we have to be smart in how we go about it. For example, as tens of millions of young people enter the job market each year, we recognize that the Arab political awakening must also deliver an economic awakening. And we are working to help societies create jobs to ensure that it does. We are promoting trade, investment, regional integration, entrepreneurship, and economic reforms. We are helping societies fight corruption and replace the old politics of patronage with a new focus on economic empowerment and opportunity. And we are working with Congress on debt relief for Egypt and loan guarantees for Tunisia so that these countries can invest in their own futures. We also have real expertise to offer as a democracy, including the wisdom that NDI has gleaned from decades of working around the globe to support democratic transitions. Democracies, after all, aren't born knowing how to run themselves. In a country like Libya, Gaddafi spent 42 years hollowing out every part of his government, not connected to oil or to keeping him in power. Under the Libyan Penal Code, simply joining an NGO could be punishable by death. When I traveled last month to Libya, the students I met at Tripoli University had all sorts of practical, even technical questions. How do you form a political party? How do you ensure women's participation in government institutions? What recommendations do you have for citizens in a democracy? These are questions NDI and its kindred organizations, many of whom are represented here tonight, are uniquely qualified to help new democracies answer. NDI has earned a lot of praise for this work, but also a lot of pushback that stretches far beyond the Arab world. In part, this resistance comes from misconceptions about what our support for democracy does and does not include. The United States does not fund political candidates or political parties. We do offer training to parties and candidates committed to democracy. We do not try to shift outcomes or impose an American model. We do support election commissions as well as non-governmental election monitors to ensure free and fair balloting. We help watchdog groups learn their trade. We help groups find the tools to exercise their rights to free expression and assembly online and off. And of course, we support civil society, the lifeblood of democratic politics. But in part, the pushback comes from autocrats around the world wondering if the next Tahrir Square will be their capital square. And some are cracking down when they should be opening up. Groups like NDI are no strangers to pressure, and neither are the brave local groups you partner with. And I want you to know that as the pressure on you increases, our support will not waver. And I want to offer a special word of thanks for NDI's efforts to empower women across the Middle East and beyond. Just last week, the World Economic Forum released a report on the remarkable benefits countries see when they bridge the social, economic, and political gaps separating women from men. And helping them get there is a priority for the State Department and for me personally. Graduates of NDI training programs designed to help women run for office now sit in local councils and parliaments from Morocco to Kuwait. But we all know a great deal of work lies ahead to help all people, women and men, find justice and opportunity as full participants in new democratic societies. Along with our economic and technical help, America will also use our presence, influence, and global leadership to support change. And later this week, I am issuing new policy guidance to our embassies across the region to structure our efforts. In Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, we are working to help citizens safeguard the principles of democracy. That means supporting the forces of reconciliation rather than retribution. It means defending freedom of expression when bloggers are arrested for criticizing public officials. It means standing up for tolerance when state-run television fans sectarian tensions. And it means that when unelected authorities say they want to be out of the business of governing, we will look to them to lay out a clear roadmap and urge them to abide by it. Where countries are making gradual reforms, we have frank conversations and urge them to move faster. It's good to hold multi-party elections and allow women to take part. It's better when those elections are meaningful and parliaments have real powers to improve people's lives. Change needs to be tangible and real. When autocrats tell us the transition to democracy will take time, we answer, well, then let's get started. And those leaders trying to hold back the future at the point of a gun should know their days are numbered. As Syrians gather to celebrate a sacred holiday, their government continues to shoot people in the streets. In the week since Bashar al-Assad said he accepted the terms of an Arab League peace plan to protect Syrian civilians, he has systematically violated each of its basic requirements. He has not released all detainees. He has not allowed free and unfettered access to journalists or Arab League monitors. He has not withdrawn all armed forces from populated areas, and he has certainly not stopped all acts of violence. In fact, the regime has increased violence against civilians in places like the city of Homs. Now, Assad may be able to delay change, but he cannot deny his people's legitimate demands indefinitely. He must step down, and until he does, America and the international community will continue to increase pressure on him and his brutal regime. And for all of Iran's bluster, there is no country in the Middle East where the gulf between rulers and ruled is greater. When Iran claims to support democracy abroad, then kills peaceful protesters in the streets of Tehran, its hypocrisy is breathtaking and plain to the people of the region. And there is one last question that I'm asked in one form or another all the time. What about the rights and aspirations of the Palestinians? Israelis and Palestinians are not immune to the profound changes sweeping the region. And make no mistake, President Obama and I believe that the Palestinian people, just like their Arab neighbors, just like Israelis, just like us, deserve dignity, liberty, and the right to decide their own future. They deserve an independent, democratic Palestinian state of their own, alongside a secure Jewish democracy next door. And we know from decades in the diplomatic trenches that the only way to get there is through a negotiated peace, a peace we work every day to achieve despite all the setbacks. Of course, we understand that Israel faces risks in a changing region, just as it did before the Arab Spring began. And it will remain an American priority to ensure that all parties honor the peace treaties they have signed and commitments they have made. And we will always help Israel defend itself. We will address threats to regional peace, whether they come from dictatorships or democracies, but it would be short-sighted to think either side can simply put peacemaking on hold until the current upheaval is done. The truth is, the stalemate in the Arab-Israeli conflict is one more status quo in the Middle East that cannot be sustained. This brings me to my last and perhaps most important point of all. For all the hard questions I've asked and tried to answer on behalf of the United States, the most consequential questions of all are those the people and leaders of the region will have to answer for themselves, because ultimately it is up to them. It is up to them to resist the calls of demagogues, to build coalitions, to keep faith in the system even when they lose at the polls, and to protect the principles and institutions that ultimately will protect them. Every democracy has to guard against those who would hijack its freedoms for ignoble ends. Our founders and every generation since have fought to prevent that from happening here. The founding fathers and mothers of Arab revolutions must do the same. No one bears a greater responsibility for what happens next. When Deputy Secretary Bill Burns addressed the National Endowment for Democracy over the summer, he recounted the story of an Egyptian teenager who told her father a few years back that she wanted to spend her life bringing democracy to Egypt. Good, her father said, because then you will always have a job. Now, we should never fall prey to the belief that human beings anywhere are not ready for freedom. In the 1970s, people said Latin America and East Asia were not ready. Well, the 1980s began proving them wrong. In the 1980s, it was African soil where democracy supposedly couldn't grow. And the 1990s started proving them wrong. And until this year, some people said Arabs don't really want democracy. Well, starting in 2011, that too is being proved wrong. And funnily enough, it proved that Egyptian father right, because we all still have a job to do. So we have to keep at it. We have to keep asking the tough questions. We have to be honest with ourselves and with each other about the answers we offer. And we cannot waver in our commitment to help the people of the Middle East and North Africa realize their own God-given potentials and the dreams they risked so much to make real. And on this journey that they have begun, the United States will be their partner. And of the many tools at our disposal, the National Endowment and NDI and all of the family of organizations that were created 3 decades ago to help people make this journey successfully will be right there. I heard Madeline say when she introduced me that I defend NDI. Well, I do, and I also defend IRI. I defend those organizations that we have created, that the American taxpayers pay for, who try to do what needs to be done to translate the rhetoric and the calls for democracy into the reality, step by step. And we have to be reminded from time to time that it truly is, or at least can seem to be, a foreign language. Like some of you, I've met with the young people who started these revolutions, and they are still passionate, but perhaps not clear about what it takes to translate that passion into reality within a political system. So there are going to be a lot of bumps along this road, but far better that we travel this path, that we do what we can to make sure that our ideals and values, our belief and experience with democracy are shared widely and well. It's an exciting time, it's an uncertain time, but it's a good time for the United States of America to be standing for freedom and democracy. And I thank you all for making that journey possible. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, for those powerful words. They mean a great deal to all of us in this room here tonight, as they will in the homes of the peoples throughout the Middle East. For those of you who have been at NDI dinners before, at this time we have usually just finished with our first course. So tonight we have finished in record time. Madam Secretary, Chairman Albright, Walter Isaacson, the Holbrook, Manat, and Zaccaro families, Dr. Kamel, and our other distinguished guests from the Middle East, members of Congress and the administration, NDI board members, and our dinner sponsors, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being with us this evening. We will see you next year. Drive home safely.